I was the bench in the square, where one love began and another ended. Broken heart, red heart, a story that will touch your heart. I was made to support tired bodies, but I ended up holding broken hearts. I saw smiles form, promises be born, and tears flow without shame. I am just a wooden bench, forgotten in the corner of a square, but here was where a love began, and where another had to end. I was once a tree, tall, firm, with roots that gripped the ground like arms that don't want to let go of what they love. I felt the wind in my branches, the birds used me as a refuge, and the days passed with the slowness of eternity, until men came with their saws and their poetryless eyes. They cut me, divided me, turned me into planks, and transported me without any ceremony. I thought my destiny would be oblivion in some construction site. But no, I was chosen for something softer. I was molded with care, sanded with precision, and before I knew it, I was being screwed into wrought iron, becoming a park bench, with delicate curves and a seat long enough for two bodies to touch without wanting to, or wanting to. I was placed right in the center of a modest square, surrounded by trees younger than I had ever been, children running around, elderly people reading the newspaper, and couples spending time. In the first few days, I felt out of place, as if I still belonged to the forest, but soon I understood that each person who sat on me left me a part of themselves, a laugh, a sigh, a smell of cheap perfume or fresh coffee, and so I became more than wood, more than an object. I became a witness, a confidant, a setting for small moments that, for those who live, might go unnoticed, but for me, are eternal. It was on an afternoon with an orange sky, the kind that warms the whole world even when the air is already starting to cool, that I saw her for the first time. Her steps were light, her blue dress swayed in the wind, and her eyes searched for something or someone with contained anxiety. She approached me, hesitated, and then sat down with the delicacy of someone who respects silence. She stayed there, looking at the other side of the square, her hands in her lap, her fingers intertwined, and then he appeared. Lucas, tall, dark hair, the look of someone carrying too many questions. He smiled when he saw her, ran to me, and sat down next to her like someone returning home after being away for too long. "I thought you weren't coming," she said, her voice thick with anticipation. "I almost didn't come, but I knew you'd be here," he replied, staring at the floor for a second, before looking into her eyes. The world seemed to go silent around them. The children ran in slow motion, the birds landed closer, and even the wind seemed to want to hear what they had to say. I, who have already endured tired and desperate bodies, noticed something different there. It wasn't love yet, but it was the spark, that delicate moment when two strangers realize that what they feel is not common. It was the beginning of something that would perhaps change everything. They stayed for hours, talking about everything and nothing, laughing at childhood stories, exchanging movie names and musical preferences, and with each laugh, with each comfortable silence, I felt as if my screws were firmer, as if my wood was more alive. It was there that I discovered that a bench can feel, yes, because feeling is not a privilege of those who have a heart, but of those who remain, and I remain. When the sun set completely, and the square began to empty, she rested her head on his shoulder and sighed, as if the day had been lighter than she had expected, and he, in silence, lightly touched her hand, without haste, without fear. It was the first touch, and I felt it, because I was the ground for those fingers that sought each other. I was the support for that love that was beginning to build. I was the setting for that moment that they might not remember later, but that I would never be able to forget. And when they got up, promising to see each other the next day, and walked away in opposite directions, still looking at each other over their shoulders, I stood there with the warm mark of their bodies, with the scent of both of them mixed in me, and with the certainty that that love had chosen my place to be born, and that, in some way that I still didn't understand, I would be part of it until the end. I will never forget that day, even with all the autumns that have fallen upon me, with all the rains that have soaked my wood and the time that insists on erasing the traces left here. Still, if I close my wooden memories, I see clearly the moment when their eyes met for the first time. It wasn't just any look, one of those hurried ones, thrown at random. It was an encounter between two worlds, two pasts, two solitudes that, without knowing it, had been searching for each other for a long time. Elisa came to the square every day, always at the same time, with her red-covered notebook and a blue pen that she twirled between her fingers when she was thinking. She sat on the left corner of my seat, always with her legs crossed and her gaze turned towards the empty bandstand, as if she expected an old melody to emerge from it, or perhaps a happy memory. Sometimes she would write for hours, other times she would just look at me as if I could answer some old question, and who knows, maybe I could if she knew how to listen. Lucas, on the other hand, was a new visitor. He appeared out of nowhere, without warning, like the wind that turns a corner and changes the direction of everything. He arrived walking slowly, his eyes wandering between the trees, like someone getting used to a new place, but there is something in certain eyes that betrays when the heart has already arrived before the body, and in his eyes there was that restlessness of someone who has seen too much, felt too much, lost too much, and yet believed that something, somewhere, was still worth it. The first time their eyes met was not in a dialogue, nor in an obvious gesture. It was from afar, in one of those almost invisible moments, when she looked up from her notebook, distracted by some random thought, and his eyes were there, waiting for her. He didn't look away, nor did he pretend to be looking at something else. He just smiled, and it was a short, shy smile, but so sincere that I almost felt my boards heat up. She frowned at first, surprised. Then she smiled back, small, restrained, and went back to her notebook as if nothing had happened. But she didn't fool anyone, least of all me. Her hands were shaking a little, her heart was beating faster. I could feel it through her legs touching me, and Lucas, he walked around the square, slowly, as if calculating the exact moment to approach something too precious to be touched in a hurry. The next day he came back, and the day after that too, and then every day. He would come, take a walk, observe, until one day, with the sun beginning to set behind the trees and the golden light painting everything with hope, he approached. She was already sitting, distracted by her notebook, and only noticed his presence when he cleared his throat, nervously, before asking, in the gentlest voice I had ever heard, "Can I sit here?" She looked at me, then at him, and then gave a slight smile, almost as if saying, "Sure," without needing words. She just pushed the notebook a little to the side, and he sat down. For the first time, the two of them were side by side, and I, in the middle, felt like I was between two hearts beating with the same rhythm. "Do you write?" he asked, pointing to the notebook. "I try," she replied, looking straight ahead but smiling. "May I ask what?" "Stories, about people, about feelings that cannot be explained. I think I like this," he said, as if he recognized himself in something. And then the silence arrived. But it wasn't an awkward silence, it was one of those that unites, that brings people closer, that allows two people to breathe the same air and understand each other without rushing. And in that silence, in that space between one word and another, between a look and a sigh, something started to happen. You can't say that it was there that they fell in love, but it was there that they decided they could try. In the following days, they talked more about books, about pain, about the fear of repeating their parents' mistakes. Lucas told her that he had just moved, that he had lost someone recently, and that he thought he would never be able to feel something real again, until he met those eyes. And Elisa, with the sweet sincerity that defined her, replied that she also carried ghosts, but that perhaps that was what made them more real. They didn't complete each other, they understood each other, and that was even rarer. And I was there listening to everything, absorbing every word, every accidental knee touch, every nervous laugh, every silence filled with good tension, and I began to understand that my role there was never just to support, but to guard that budding love like someone guarding a secret too precious for the world to see before its time. In that simple square, with leaves dancing in the wind and the sweet smell of the late afternoon, a love began, not with declarations, nor with cinematic kisses, but with a look, and then another, and another, until the eyes recognized each other and decided to stay. Spring arrived like an old song, one of those that we no longer know how to sing, but our hearts still remember. The flowers began to open timidly in the flower beds of the square, the previously dry branches filled with new leaves, and the air became lighter, sweeter, as if even time had decided to give beauty a chance, and they bloomed along with all of this. Elisa and Lucas started coming every day. as if that routine was the only remedy against the world outside, and I, once again, was the silent setting of this story that unfolded slowly, with the calm of romances that know where they want to go. Elisa brought sweetbreads wrapped in a cloth napkin with a floral print, and Lucas sometimes came with poetry books or old records, and sat next to her as if he occupied the most sacred place in the universe. They didn't need to say much. It was enough to be there, sharing that bench, that time, that space that was no longer public. It was theirs, and mine, by extension, because I was the one who held back the laughter, the whispers, the light gestures, the hands that sought each other in the middle of a sentence, as if the language of touch said more than any words. "Do you know what I like most about this place?" she asked on a day when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at it. "What?" he replied, his eyes closed, his head resting on the iron headrest. "We don't need to rush, here, everything can wait, even the pain." He looked at her tenderly, and I felt, with all my heart, how much that phrase had been engraved in him, as if each word were a root deepening in the soil of his soul, and it was at this pace that their love was being made, without haste, without labels, without that consuming urgency. They were getting to know each other in the details, in the repeated gestures, in the habits, and even in the insecurities that were gradually revealing themselves. Elisa, with her fear of being forgotten, Lucas, with his guilt for having loved before, but there, with me, they seemed to forget the rest of the world. One afternoon, when the square was more crowded than usual, Lucas brought a surprise. He took a small, rustic wooden box out of his pocket and handed it to Elisa with a nervous smile. She opened it slowly, as if she already knew that inside there would be something too delicate to be touched quickly, and it was, inside, there was a simple ring, without a stone, without shine, but with something infinitely more precious. The initials of both engraved by himself, along with a phrase that made me tremble to the core. "When we feel, we don't need to explain." She didn't cry, nor scream, nor kiss him right away. She just looked at him for a long time, and I swear by everything I saw, that in that look there was room for the entire universe. Then she smiled, put the ring on her finger and said, "I'm very sorry." He didn't answer with words. He just held her hand, squeezed it tightly, and rested his forehead against hers, in silence, and there they were, small in front of the world, but immense for each other, and I, once again, was the invisible altar where this exchange of wordless promises was made. I was the guardian of that moment, like so many others that would come. As the days went by, they started bringing blankets to sit on. They even came when it rained, with big umbrellas and soaking wet clothes, just so they wouldn't miss that ritual. Sometimes, they slept there, leaning against each other, under the sky full of stars. I felt their weight change when one lay on the other's lap, or when she reached out to adjust his scarf, small gestures. But that's what love is made of, isn't it? Of what no one sees, of what only those who stay notice. It was at this stage that Lucas brought out a hidden razor and, looking at her with that mischievous smile, asked, "Can I do something stupid?" "Only if it's with emotional responsibility," she joked, laughing. And he, like a teenager who wants to immortalize the moment, engraved our initials on the arm of my seat. L+E inside a poorly drawn heart, but so full of meaning that to this day I carry it with pride. It didn't hurt, not physically, but each cut made there carried so much emotion that it seemed to burn inside me, and I liked that, because now I was part of them in a more intimate way. Now, they were marked on me, as I was already marked on them. At that time, I thought that nothing could change, that those two would be there forever, and maybe they thought so too. But life, that unpredictable lady, likes to change the scripts when the audience has already memorized the lines, and I, who have seen so many beginnings and ends, felt a slight tremor in the air, something that warned me quietly that not every spring lasts forever, but at that moment, it was just perfume, laughter and love. It was just the beauty of two hearts that had finally found the same rhythm. Some marks are made by force, others with love, but there are those that appear so delicately that you almost don't notice they are there until time passes and they become part of who we are. It was like that with the initials of Elisa and Lucas, which still rest on my left arm today, a little crooked, but full of truth. The iron of the knife scratched my surface, yes, but what really left a mark was the feeling that slipped along with that gesture, and everything that came after came to deepen even more what was already drawn, not in the wood, but in the destiny of the two. After that day, the square became a whole world to them. They began to keep memories like someone collecting small treasures, leaves that fell from a specific tree, dried flowers inside Elisa's notebook, movie tickets, notes scribbled in hurried writing. Everything gained meaning. Everything was a reason to celebrate what they were building, and they built it, brick by brick, with love, care, and also with those uncomfortable silences that arise when two hearts get too close. One of those days, when the sun was already starting to hide behind the buildings and the golden light made everything seem more beautiful than it really was, Elisa arrived alone. She sat in the same place as always, took out her notebook, but didn't write. She stayed there, staring at my back, her fingers tracing the heart that Lucas had made. Her eyes were moist, and even without saying a word, I knew that something wasn't right. And when Lucas arrived, with the same smile as always, she just looked up and said, "Can we talk?" Those 4 words, spoken in a low but firm voice, caused the air around them to change. He nodded, sat down next to her, and then silence stretched like a thick veil between the two of them, until she continued. "Do you remember what you told me about what you lost?" Lucas remained still, but I noticed the way his hand tightened on his knee, as if he was preparing for some pain, and she, with her eyes fixed on his, added, "I also lost a baby 2 years ago." It was as if time had stopped for a moment. The square continued its rhythm. Children were still running. Someone passed by with a dog barking in the background, but there, in that small universe in which they were inserted, there was only silence, and an old bench that felt everything. Lucas took a while to respond. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood the depth of that confession. She didn't want consolation, nor an explanation. She just wanted to be seen, whole, with all her scars. "I didn't know," he murmured, his eyes welling up. "Nobody knows," she replied with a half smile, "but I thought you deserved to know, because you make me want to again believe, dream, and that scares me." He took her hand, slowly, as if holding something very fragile, and said, "I'm afraid too, but not of you." That conversation, however brief it may have been, changed the tone of things. After that, they began to look at each other more deeply, as if they had seen in each other not only the charm, but also the shadows, and yet, they chose to stay. It was at that time that they began to dream together. They talked about living nearby in a small apartment, but with a balcony. They talked about children, about trips, about Sundays with freshly brewed coffee. They talked as if they were building a bridge to the future, and each of those words landed on me like a light leaf, but with time, it formed an entire forest of memories. Elisa started writing more, and one afternoon she left the notebook open on me while she ran to a newsstand to buy something, and I, curious as I am, let the wind turn a page. There, in the middle of so many texts, a poem with my name. She wrote about me, about how I was an accomplice, about how my silence spoke louder than the noise of the streets, about how I was the only one who saw her love being born, growing, and now, something inside me broke, with emotion, with pride, because even though it was just wood, I knew that somehow, it was also love. But like every good story, there was something hidden, something that not even they knew yet, but that time would soon reveal. Lucas started receiving calls that he didn't answer in front of her, messages that he deleted too quickly, lost glances in the middle of the conversation. Elisa felt it. She was always good at feeling it, but she preferred not to ask, like someone who postpones pain for fear of what they will hear, and I, quiet, could only wait, as I always waited, because love is made of sweet moments, yes, but also of secrets, and sometimes, it is these secrets that decide the course of everything. At that stage, they still came, still laughed, still touched each other with affection, but there was a shadow growing behind each word, and I, who was the first to feel the warmth of their love, also began to feel the cold that precedes loss. But at that moment, there was still light, there was still hope, there was still time. And no matter how much my wood ages and my screws rust, I know how to recognize when something is worth it, and that love, even with its cracks, was still the most beautiful I've ever seen born. That morning smelled like change, even though no one said anything. The square was emptier than usual, the sky was heavy with clouds, the wind restless, as if the whole world was trying to whisper something that no one wanted to hear, and that I already knew, since the night before when Lucas passed by me alone, with his shoulders hunched and his eyes deep in thoughts he didn't share with anyone. He sat for a few minutes, but he didn't lean against me like he usually did, he didn't rest his arms on me, he didn't smile, he stayed there, motionless, staring at the ground, until he got up and left without looking back. And when someone leaves like that, you feel it, even though it's just wood. I felt it. The next day, Elisa arrived first, and that was rare. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee from a new coffee shop in town, her hair tied up in a messy bun and her usual red notebook under her arm. She sat in the same place as always, placed the cups on me, opened the notebook and sat there, writing words that, perhaps, she herself didn't fully understand yet. She seemed light, like someone who doesn't imagine that she is about to hear something that will change everything. And that was the most painful part, seeing her lightness about to be broken. Lucas arrived with slow steps, hands in his pockets and his gaze lowered. He stopped a few meters away, took a deep breath, and only then approached. She smiled when she saw him, holding out one of the cups naturally, but he hesitated before taking it. He sat down next to her, but didn't kiss her or touch her, and Elisa, who had always been made of sensitivity, noticed. She slowly lowered her notebook and looked at him with those eyes that knew too much. "What happened?" she asked, almost in a whisper. He took a while to answer, his eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead, and then he said, in a different voice, colder, more distant, "I was called for a project abroad. Barcelona, 6 months." Silence fell like a storm, heavy, wet, inevitable. She didn't respond immediately, she just leaned her back against the bench, as if she needed support to keep from collapsing, and I was there, holding the weight of both of them, trying to understand how to sustain a love when it starts to fall apart. "And when did you decide you weren't going to tell me before?" she asked, firmly, but with tears in her eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to say it. So you preferred to let time resolve it?" She laughed, a joyless laugh. "Lucas, I trusted you. I surrendered myself to this, to us." He turned his face to her, and for the first time in that conversation, there was pain in his eyes too. "I gave myself up too, Elisa, but I need to go. I need this, it's my dream." She closed her eyes, and a few tears escaped without resistance. It wasn't just sadness, it was a cruel mix of love, anger, frustration, of wanting him to stay, but also understanding why he needed to leave. "And us?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Were we just a station? An interval between you and your dreams? Don't say that, you know you don't. So tell me, how do we continue?" He didn't answer, because he didn't know either, and sometimes, not knowing is what hurts the most. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. It was the silence after the news, the one that comes when there are no more words that make sense, when everything that could be said has been lost in the wind. They stayed there for a while longer, each one lost in their own thoughts, the coffee getting cold, time passing, and I was trying to hold it all in, even though I knew there wouldn't be enough wood in me to contain so much pain. That night, Lucas came back one last time. He was alone again, and this time he didn't sit down, he just ran his hand over the heart he had drawn, and stood there, still, as if he was saying goodbye not only to a place, but to a part of himself. Then he left, and his steps, which had been firm before, now seemed to be loaded with a weight that he didn't even know he had. Elisa came the next day, and the next, and many others. Sometimes she wrote, sometimes she just stared into space, sometimes she cried, other times she just stood there like someone waiting for time to bring back what it took, and I, old, marked, cracked, was the only one who saw it all, the only one who remained. Because, sometimes, there are no villains, there are no guilty parties, there are just two paths that, no matter how much they touch, cannot go together for long, and that's what happened there. Their love didn't end for lack of feeling, it ended because the world is cruel to those who love slowly. But even with the end, even with the distance, something remained, something that time cannot take away, and I keep that something inside me every time the sun rises and warms the wood where they were. Because as long as I exist, that love will also exist, in silence, but it will exist. Autumn arrived with a melancholic beauty. The trees in the square began to slowly undress, as if they were ashamed of being naked in front of such a gray sky. The leaves, once green and alive, now fell one by one, yellowed, fragile, and accumulated over me like a quilt made of goodbyes. The air was colder, more humid, heavier, and I, who already carried within me the silence of that news that broke two hearts, knew that the following days would bring no healing. They would only bring the inevitable. Elisa came early that day. She was wearing a beige coat, a turtleneck, and her eyes, oh, her eyes were different. There was a sad firmness in them, a kind of strength that only those who have understood that it will hurt anyway can carry. She sat in the same corner as always, opened her notebook, scribbled a few sentences, and then stopped. She stared at me as if my tablet still had something to offer, but at that moment, not even I knew how to support what was coming next. Lucas arrived almost at sunset. His steps were slow, dragging, and he was carrying a white envelope in his hands, half crumpled, and his gaze, that gaze that begs for time to go back, even though he knows it's too late. When he sat down next to her, no one said anything. They just stayed there for long minutes, breathing the same silence, listening to the sound of dry leaves being stepped on by those passing by, of branches creaking in the wind, and of their own hearts beating out of tune. "It's tomorrow," he said finally, in a low tone, as if he were afraid to give form to what was already real. She just nodded, not looking at him. Thought about not going. But that would be cowardly. It's not cowardice to be afraid, Lucas. Cowardice is pretending it doesn't hurt. And you? Are you going to hate me? She turned her face towards him, slowly, and said, But maybe I need some time to remember you without it hurting." Those words hung in the air for a while, like leaves that spin before touching the ground. And Lucas, with full eyes, handed her the envelope. "It's for you. I wrote it yesterday. Everything I wanted to say and couldn't." Elisa held the envelope delicately, but did not open it. She simply placed it inside the notebook. "I'll keep it. Maybe one day I'll read it. Maybe when I stop waiting for you to come back." At that moment, a gust of wind caused a mass of leaves to scatter across the square, swirling around them, as if the world were trying to interrupt that moment, but nothing could interrupt what was coming next. They looked at each other, and in their eyes there was everything that their mouths could no longer say. Gratitude, pain, love, anger, tenderness, and that terrible certainty that not all love can withstand time or distance. Elisa was the first to move. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, put her notebook in her bag. Lucas remained seated, his hands clasped together, his gaze lost. "Get up," she said, her voice shaking. "But because I need your hug. One last one, before I give up on letting you go." He stood up slowly, and there, among dry leaves, a cloudy sky, and a bench that was almost crying, they hugged each other. Tightly, like someone holding on to a dream that is about to disappear. It wasn't just any hug, it was the kind of hug that tries to mend torn hearts, that begs for more time, that says everything that can't be put into words. They stayed like that for a long time, breathing each other in, as if they were trying to memorize the smell, the warmth, the presence. "Promise me one thing," she whispered. "Anything. If one day this is still love, you come back." He didn't respond with words. He just hugged her tighter. And that was enough. When the hug ended, there were tears on both of their faces. But not tears of despair. They were mature tears. The kind that flow because they need to, not because there is still hope of changing fate. And then she walked away, one step, then another, until she turned her back and walked towards the exit of the square, her shoulders held high, but her heart in ruins. Lucas stayed for a few more moments. He looked at the sky, at the trees, at me. He ran his hand over the carved heart, now worn by time, and took a deep breath, then he turned and left. And there, in that square covered in autumn, I remained, with the weight of the last embrace between dry leaves, with the memory of the love I saw being born and the farewell I was forced to keep. Because, sometimes, all we have left is to be a witness of a love that was beautiful and of a pain that was necessary. The days began to pass with the haste of someone who wants to forget. The autumn leaves were blown away by the wind, the square became emptier, and their absence became my new silence. I felt each morning without her perfume, each afternoon without his footsteps, and even though I was made of wood, I knew that something in me had also been left behind in that last embrace. Time, that stubborn old man, began to do its work. My wood began to crack in some places, the paint on the heart engraved by Lucas began to fade, the initials began to disappear little by little, as if they were forgotten, but the feeling remained. Other bodies came, other stories began, laughter was exchanged in my seat, some tears too. I saw teenage loves emerging and ending in the late afternoon. I saw ladies alone reading old letters. I saw parents rocking their children to the sound of the leaves that whispered overhead, and even with so many stories passing by me, there's continued, alive, hidden in every fiber of my being. Sometimes, when the square was empty, the wind seemed to carry her scent, the sound of his laughter, like an echo of something that still lived among the trees. I waited, because I didn't know how to do anything else. I hoped that one of them would return someday. And many months passed like that. It was almost a year later that she appeared again. Lisa. But she was no longer the same. Her hair was shorter, her face was thinner, her eyes were harder, but she was still her. She walked with firmer steps, as if she had learned to defend herself from her own longing. She sat down in the same place as always, took out a new notebook, this time black, and remained silent for a while. Then she took the crumpled white envelope he had left from her pocket. She took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, opened it. I couldn't read what was written, but I saw the tears that fell one by one, wetting the paper, as if each word had finally found its right place. She read it all slowly, and when she finished, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were embracing something without touching it. Then she stood up, slowly passed her hand over her faded heart, and whispered, "It's still here." And then, for the first time, he smiled. A sad smile, but a genuine one. Like someone who finally accepts that what was beautiful doesn't have to hurt forever. She came back more often, not as often as before, but enough for me to realize that the pain had turned into a gentle longing. She wrote a lot. Sometimes she read out loud passages that I couldn't understand, but I felt, because emotion, that doesn't need translation. And little by little, she became part of the square again, part of my routine again, but without waiting. She no longer waited for him to come back. She just kept it inside. And that's when someone new appeared. He was an older man, unshaven, with kind eyes. He would sometimes sit next to me, and the two of them would talk about everything, but never about the past. They would laugh lightly, share coffee, stroll through the trees, and little by little, I realized she was allowing herself to feel again. The heart sculpted by Lucas almost no longer existed. The rain, time, the sun, everything was erasing the marks. But I knew exactly where each line, each letter, each curve was. Because time can hide what is truly lived, but it never erases it. Lucas, that one, never came back. Or at least not during those months. But something told me that he also carried me, that even on the other side of the world, perhaps in another square, perhaps sitting on another bench, he thought of her here, in that place, at that time. Life went on as it does for everyone. The square changed, it got new lights, a modern drinking fountain, a new paint job on me, but no painter could completely hide what I once was. There were still scratches on the sides, small cracks that seemed to scream old stories, and sometimes, a new couple would ask me what they meant. I didn't answer, of course, but inside, I smiled, because time, even with its haste, has never managed to completely erase what they left behind. And as long as I remain here, strong even with my cracks, that love, even if interrupted, will continue to exist. Not as a wound, but as a memory, one of those loves that were not made to last, but rather to leave a mark. And maybe that's what we're all looking for, not an eternal love, but one that transforms us. Time, despite being relentless, is also generous with those who learn to wait without rushing, and it was in this more serene pace that Elisa began to return to me, no longer as someone looking for answers, but as someone who finds a piece of herself in the place where it all began, only now, with different eyes, a different smile, and someone else by her side. He arrived slowly, without promises, without haste, with the calm of someone who respects the spaces occupied by memories. His name was Daniel, and his presence was different from Lucas's. It wasn't a hurricane, it was a breeze. The kind that touches your face and warms you, but doesn't change the direction of the trees. His eyes didn't carry too much of the past, nor too much of the future. They carried the present. And it was in this present that Elisa finally decided to take a deep breath and open the windows of her chest again. The first time they sat down together with me, she seemed tense. She looked around frequently, as if expecting to see some ghost hiding among the trees. Daniel noticed, of course, but he didn't ask anything. He just offered her a chocolate that he took out of his pocket, with an unpretentious smile. "Chocolate helps," he said. She laughed, a short laugh, but it reminded me of the sound she made when she was with Lucas. She took the candy and replied, "Not everything, but it's a good start." It was a clear afternoon with few passers-by in the square. The air was fresh, with the smell of damp earth and flowers beginning to bloom. And there, in that familiar setting, I saw Elisa begin to give in, like someone walking barefoot on ground that was once painful, but is now softer. In the following days, they came back again. They talked about books, music, and everyday things. And, slowly, Daniel began to realize that the bench where they sat was not neutral. There was a story there. Something silent, invisible, but very present. One afternoon, he ran his fingers over the faded marks on the left arm of the bench and asked, "This here, was it you?" Elisa hesitated, looked at the exact spot where there had been a heart with initials engraved on it, sighed. It was a long time ago. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't ask who the other was, he didn't want to know any details. He just took her hand gently and said, "You don't have to tell me anything, just let me stay." Those words stayed with her. And with me too. Because there are loves that are born from fear, and others that grow from silence. And what was born between the two of them was like that, slow, respectful, beautiful. Over time, Elisa began to relax next to him. She no longer looked around as much, and she no longer avoided his touch. She began to write again, now more frequently, and sometimes she read aloud what she wrote, while Daniel listened with his eyes, with his gestures, with his whole body. And I, a silent witness, felt a calm affection grow between them, without fanfare, but full of truth. Daniel brought a new energy to the square. He played with the children who passed by, helped the elderly with their carts, and greeted the dogs as if they were old friends. Little by little, he became part of the scene, and even I, old and scarred, got used to his presence, like someone who learns to welcome the new without betraying what has already been. There was one day, however, when everything almost fell apart. Elisa showed up earlier than usual alone. She sat at the opposite end of the table from where she usually sat with Daniel, holding the closed notebook on her lap. Her face was tense, her eyes red. She stood there for long minutes without moving until, in an impulsive gesture, she took a small box out of her pocket. It was the ring, the one Lucas had given her, hand engraved, with so much meaning. She looked at him as if she were looking at a mistake and a memory at the same time. And then, in one swift movement, he placed it between the boards of my backrest, pushing it into an old crack that was already part of my scars. Then he took a deep breath, stood up and left. The next afternoon, she returned with Daniel. She was smiling, but there was something different, a lightness, as if she had finally let go of a weight she had been carrying for too long. They sat together, and she rested her head on his shoulder and said, "Do you know why I like coming here? Because that's where you learn to love? No, because that's where I learned to start over." And it was there, with the sun setting and the birds singing softly, that I understood that even if the engraved name disappears, even if the bodies change and the chapters move on, the feeling remains. And love can be born more than once in the same place. That afternoon smelled like destiny. The sky was divided between the golden end of the day and a light mist that seemed to want to hide something, or perhaps to prepare the heart of someone who, like me, had already seen everything, but was still moved by the improbable. Daniel and Elisa had come earlier that week, sat down, laughed, shared chestnuts and light memories. She seemed well, whole, carefully reconstructed, like someone who picks up the pieces and makes something new out of them. But that day, at that exact moment, I knew. Something was approaching. Something that neither time, nor silence, nor new beginnings had managed to completely erase. I saw the figure before I even understood. Someone standing on the other side of the square, in the shadows, watching. Firm, hesitant. A man. Tall, dark coat. Hands in his pockets. His eyes, even from a distance, said everything. I would recognize that look anywhere, because I was the first to see him being born. It was Lucas. He didn't approach her right away. He stood there for long minutes, as if the entire square had stopped breathing with him. His eyes never left Elisa, who was alone that day, sitting with her notebook on her lap, writing calmly. Her hair tied in a messy bun, her light coat, her expression serene. Lucas seemed to be fighting something inside him. Part of him wanted to leave. The other, he just wanted to see her up close, hear her voice. Feel if there was still anything left. And then he started walking. My screws rattled as his footsteps pounded the stone path that led to me. Each step was a jolt of memory. He seemed thinner, his eyes more shadowed, his body stiffer, but it was still him. He was still the man who had loved her with a beautiful and disastrous intensity. Elisa saw him when he was just a few feet away, and time stood still. She froze. Her fingers clasped around the pen, her breath held, her gaze lost between doubt and certainty. Because there was no denying it. It was him. And no past is so past that it cannot be relived with a simple glance. "Hi," he said, his voice hoarse, heavy with a world that had passed without her. "Lucas," was all she could say in a whisper. He sat down next to her, but kept a respectful distance. They stayed like that for a few seconds, side by side, without touching, without smiling, just breathing the same air for the first time in years. The square followed its rhythm, but between them, there was only silence. And everything that was never said. "Are you back?" she asked, without taking her eyes off her notebook. "Oh, just stop by. I'm leaving again." Silence. "I was afraid to see you," he said finally. "Afraid to find you happy with someone else." "And you?" "I found a lot of things, but nothing that was you." She closed the notebook slowly and placed it aside. She looked at him. And in that look there was more than longing. There was a gentle, mature sadness that only time brings. "You left me, Lucas. And I had to learn not to wait anymore." He lowered his head. The guilt weighed heavily on him. But there was also a gleam in his eyes. A flame that still burned for her. "I thought about you every day. Every corner of the world I knew, every new place. It seemed incomplete. Because it wasn't with you." Elisa took a deep breath. She ran her hand through her hair and eyes, as if trying to get the weight of that conversation off her chest. "Don't say that. It took me a long time to gather what you left." "And him?" Lucas asked, pointing with his eyes to a discreet ring on her finger. She looked at the ring and then smiled slightly. "He found me when I had already given up on being found. And he didn't ask me to forget anything. He just offered me a place to be who I am now." Lucas nodded. There was no anger, just pain. "So you are happy?" She thought for a few seconds before answering. "I am. In a new way. Less intense, more real." Lucas stood up. He knew there was no more room for him there. But before he went, he slowly approached the back of the bench, ran his fingers over the spot where he had engraved the heart, now almost invisible, and smiled melancholy. "I thought time had erased everything. Time erases names, Lucas, but not what we feel inside." He looked at her one last time. With tenderness, with pain, with peace. "You were my most beautiful love. And you, it was love that taught me to lose and to continue." And then he left. No promises, no future reunions. He just left. And Elisa stayed. For a long time. Looking at the place where he had been. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just felt. And I, once again, kept everything. Because there are reunions that don't serve to start over. They serve to close a chapter. And sometimes, that's all we need. After Lucas left, the square returned to its gentle rhythm. The wind blew like someone blowing out candles on an old birthday. The sky slowly opened up and the day ended with that golden light that transforms everything into a beautiful memory. Elisa stayed there, alone for a while longer. Her eyes still turned towards the path where he disappeared, but there was no sadness on her face. There was peace, the kind that only comes when the heart understands that not every absence has to hurt forever. She ran her fingers over the backrest, exactly where he had once engraved the heart. The drawing was no longer there, but Elisa smiled and whispered as if she were talking to me. "Thank you for keeping us, even when we were no more." The next morning, she returned with Daniel. She held his hand firmly, her gaze clearer, her step lighter. They sat together, as was their custom, and he noticed that something in her had changed. "It's different," he said, looking at her affectionately. "I am," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. "I think that I left a piece of myself in the past yesterday. And I didn't miss it." Daniel smiled, that calm smile of someone who knows how to wait. Then he took a small book of poems from his pocket and opened it to a marked page. "Can I read something to you?" She nodded. He began to recite, his voice calm. "Everything that is true love never ends, it just changes shape, address, embrace. Sometimes it turns into longing, other times it blossoms again." She rested her head on his shoulder, and for a few seconds, there was no one else in the world, just the two of them, and me, the old bench in the square, with my tired wood and my heart full of stories. I, who had seen beginnings and ends, tears and laughter, departures and reunions, now saw something new. Not an explosive love, the kind that burns and blazes, but a love that warms, that welcomes, that builds. The following afternoons were full of small rituals. Elisa began to read to Daniel. He brought wildflowers and left them on me, and sometimes, the two of them would just sit in silence, listening to the birds sing and watching time pass, as if they were no longer in a hurry to get anywhere. They were their whole present, as if each day were a continuation of what they had begun to write together without knowing it. One afternoon, Daniel arrived first. He was carrying a small box in his hands and his eyes were shining. When she arrived, he stood up, nervous, and said, "I know this bank has seen a lot, so I think it can see one more." She smiled in surprise. He knelt down, opening the box with a simple, delicate ring. "I don't want to be the new love that erases the old one. I want to be the love that remains when the dust settles, that builds after the storm. Do you accept to continue writing this story with me?" Elisa didn't answer right away. She looked around as if searching for an answer in the trees, the leaves, the sky, and then she looked at me. She touched the backrest affectionately, as if she were thanking me, and said, with tears in her eyes and a light heart, "I accept, because here I learned that love doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be true." They hugged each other tightly, like someone who finds each other after a long search. And I, who had been the beginning of one love and the end of another, understood that now I was also the home of a new beginning. The square remained alive, full of children, laughter, hurried steps, and I, with my marks, my memories and my secrets, remained there, waiting for the next story. Because as long as there is someone willing to love, to dream, to start over, I will be here. I'm just a park bench. But here, a love began. Another ended. And a new one, more mature, calmer, began again. And that is all I ever wanted to keep.